Hi everyone, Tim here. I'm going to do a Group D preview. I did a video on Group B a few days ago. Enjoyed doing that, talking about the group, the different teams, and previewing each one. So I'm going to do this in a very similar way. I might be a little bit quicker moving through it, try to keep it a little bit shorter to watch, but I'll try to hit some of the main strengths and the main weaknesses for each of the four teams in the group. Put them in the order that I think they're going to finish, starting at fourth up to first. And just talk about what I think about each team, and hopefully it'll have some interesting observations and a bit of a different take. So let's get started just by first looking at who the teams are in Group D. So we've got Royal Never Give Up, second place finishers in the LPL. We have Samsung Galaxy from the LCK, who won through in the regional gauntlet. We have Splyce from Europe, again another gauntlet winner from Europe, and Team SoloMid, which naturally everybody watching this video is watching because they are TSM fans and they want to hear another set of opinions on TSM. So if that's all you really care about, I'll put a timestamp in the video description on YouTube, and you can jump right through to that. So let's start off with the team I have ranked fourth, which is Splyce. So this is a team that came out of nowhere, obviously, this year, kind of this split. They were not very good in the spring after they first qualified in. They got a lot better in summer with the one roster change to bring in Mickey X at support. And ultimately their main strengths didn't change, even though the team itself, performed a lot differently. I think their strong solo laners are a big deal. So they have Wonder in top lane, Sevenhuysen in mid, and those two strong solo laners are really important, especially in the mid and late game. Neither of them is a really fantastic laner 1v1. In fact, they're both, they're maybe mediocre, maybe a little bit weak, I would say, for Senkux in the 1v1. Some of that has to do with the champions they pick, so I don't want to be overly critical on that. But when it gets to the mid and late game, if they're set up for it and if they have the opportunity in front of them, both of them can really carry games, really explode and kind of hard carry that way. Because they've got the two strong solo laners and because they've learned to coordinate well as a team, they're a really good split pushing team. And you've probably heard this discussed if you've watched them play in Europe. If you haven't watched them, this is new for you, and that's great. They're really good at especially 1-3-1 split pushing. 4-1 split pushing, they don't do quite as much, but because they've got these two solo laners who like to play champions that are individually strong and can carry and usually have dueling potential, they set up these 1-3-1s. They manage them very well. In my last video, I criticized Flash Wolves for being poor split pushers and not managing their multiple pressure points and kind of coordinating when they were pushing and when they were pulling back. Splyce does all of this very well. It's one of the things it's probably the strongest thing about them as a team, I would say. And it starts with them having those two strong solo laners and building around that. As for weaknesses, and there are plenty of those, they've got a relatively weak early game. And now, if you look at them just statistically, and you look at, say, their regular season goal difference at 15 minutes, you could also look at the early game rating. I'd have to give you a bit of you can go read about that stat and how it works and what it represents on oracle.elixir.com, but I'll look at the more easily accessed goal difference at 15. In regular season, they were plus 239, so that's not bad. That's pretty good. That's maybe, I think, top 3 or 4 in Europe. So that doesn't suggest that they're a weak early game team. But the interesting thing about their early game is that they do pretty well against teams that are worse than them in the early game, which makes sense. But when they're against teams with really good early games, I think they often struggle quite a bit. So you saw that in the playoffs when they came up against especially G2 esports in the finals, their goal difference at 15 was negative 1,500, which is just horrible. So their early game got just dismantled, torn apart. Their usual early game approach is to kind of weather the storm. They want to get to that mid game where they're strongest with their carries, and Kabi as their AD carry comes into that, being a good team fighter. He deserves praise for that as well. So all three of their carries, really, they want to hit that mid game. So Trashy's early game approach is really a huge piece for them because he's a very defensive jungler. He wants to cover the river with wards. He ganks a lot for Wonder, and especially, but he does a lot of counter ganking. So he does a lot of kind of countering the enemy jungler, and that helps them get through the early game safely. And it's Trashy. He has a lot of things that he's good at, but it's mostly this kind of managing the early game. He obviously does ganking. He does have a very high first blood rate, but as a whole, as the early game as a whole, not just kind of the first 3, 4, 5 levels where that first gank comes in. It's more on that game management approach. So their weak game as a whole, I'm not a huge fan of it. Their weak early game, I should say. And then later on in the game, their playmaking is not super refined. Mickey X was, obviously him being the one roster change that came in for the summer, and it's the simple narrative is to credit him with a big part of the turnaround that got this team to Worlds. He brought in a lot of playmaking, and sorry, that narrative isn't really complete, but he brought in a lot of playmaking that they didn't really have, and it was a really valuable added piece. He's got an aggressive mindset. He wants to put himself out there. But as a team, their playmaking lacks some kind of coherence in how they go about it. You have things like Wonder is the kind of player who will play Gangplank and will teleport into a flanking position and try to come in and as if he was a tank and initiator, or that's not how Gangplank should be played. He's not the only one who has made that mistake, but he did it in the playoffs a few times. As a team, they just struggle to go out and make things happen, which is one of the reasons that they do so much 1-3-1 split pushing, which is a much more conservative way to apply pressure and close the game, as opposed to the kind of decisive, aggressive jump on a fight, make it happen, and you get a big gain all at once. So when I watch Splyce and I see them being the ones out there throwing punches and actually not playing a pressure game but playing a fighting game, I think they're a little bit less comfortable, and it tends not to go as well for them. So a big question that I have for Splyce is, are they going to play to their strengths? And partly, are they going to be able to play to their strengths? Will they get to that mid game? Will they be able to set up their split push? Or are they going to try to diversify themselves? Because this is something we sometimes see on the international stage, is a team will think, the way we got here, it got us here, but it wasn't good enough. We need to be even better. And they'll go and they'll try to add an entirely new dimension to their game. And sometimes they overreach. They try to do too much. And it just kind of, they shoot themselves in the foot. I think Splyce might be in this position. I think they need to, obviously they need to improve their early game, and they should improve their playmaking, but not at the expense of maintaining their identity as a strong split pushing mid-game team who's able to, get these leads of play from ahead in the mid-game. So hopefully they'll be able to play to their strengths. They're going to have to improve their ability to make it to that mid-game intact enough to make that happen. So let's move on to the next team, Royal Never Give Up. So this is where the ranking challenges really get tough. So I put Royal number 3. You could argue them at number 2. I think it's a little bit of a stretch to me to put them number 1, but I put them number 3. And here's some of the reasons why. So obviously on the side of strengths, they have incredible talent across the entire roster. Everybody's going to tell you this. All 5 of their players are really good. To just get into it a little bit briefly, so Looper is a guy who can play a lot of different things. He played Singed in the playoffs and won on it. That's just crazy. He was a big Quinn guy in spring, from what I can remember. He's pretty self-sufficient in the lane. He doesn't get a lot of help because Royal is a very bottom-focused team. So he's a very a solid top laner. MLXG at jungle, he can do everything. He's very versatile. He can gank, he can counter gank, he can invade and play a counter jungling game. He did a lot of counter ganking versus Aimee as an example, if you want to check out that angle of his game. So he's very versatile. Xiaohu, playmaking mid laner, he has a really good Vladimir who can snowball really hard. Uzi and Mata are one of the best 2v2 lanes in terms of pure laning and mechanics. And so all of these 5 players have a lot of talent and can do a lot of good things. They all are very versatile as well. So even Uzi, whose reputation for his entire career is he's a flashy, hard carry, very high mechanics player, he wants to go out and kind of 1v5 the enemy team, and you better get behind him and help him out, because that's the reputation for him. He's not just a 1-note AD carry, though. He can play a really good supportive Jhin who hangs back, uses his ultimate for utility. He can do this as well. So he and the rest of the team, they're all very versatile. They can do multiple things, play different roles, but they're also very volatile. Uzi is an aggressive player. He can step too far forward and get caught out. Mata has been criticized a lot this summer for roaming in weird places, getting caught. MLXG, you might have noticed him going off and doing his own split push thing. And so there's some strange things that they can do individually with their decision making. So on the positive side, all of this talent, and all five of them honestly can be playmakers. So that allows them to build some giant snowballs. When they're doing well, they crush you. They roll over you. They can end the games really quickly. And I'm saying they can. They don't always, but they have so much playmaking from every avenue that they have this potential to be a very snowbally team. That can go against them as well because they can throw games, and I think I have that point in here a little bit out of order, but they can throw games in here. They can go out and try to force something, and a lot of the time it's going to work. If they already have a lead, it's going to be more likely to work. If they don't already have a lead, it's more likely to fail, and they might throw the game. But even when they do have a lead, since they are out there trying to start a fight, kind of the opposite of Splyce, they're not playing the conservative map control pressure game. They're out there trying to throw punches and land haymakers, and that can get them punished in return and throw the game. And another criticism I have for them is that when you watch their games, they're teams that are very good at picking fights in just the right time and place, where they've got the lanes, the minion wave pushed to the right spot, so they get a kill and they get a tower, that kind of thing. This is not something Royal is very good at when I watch them. They don't really properly time or place their fights, so they might get a kill or two, but they aren't in position to get an objective afterwards. And that means that, while they do have this big snowball potential, when the fights do work out in the right place, they win a lot of fights back to back to back, when they aren't necessarily, they rely on winning a lot of fights, because eventually then those add up in small ways. They aren't necessarily fighting at the enemy tower or with a minion wave or whatever it is, or around a dragon or a baron. So I think they need to improve a lot at knocking down towers efficiently by chipping damage into them, not just always looking for a fight, but landing chip damage on the tower, so that when you do get the kill, the tower's low enough that you can finish it, and things like this. So these are things that they need to work on as a team. So a big question I have for Royal: are they all going to be on the same page? Are they going to be making their plays as a unit, not just as solo players? And I think that's something that they are really going to have to work on, because sometimes you see them, with these five playmakers out there, not just one or two main playmakers. Sometimes they go and they try to make multiple plays all at once. They don't really seem to have communicated what are we doing as a team. It's more, what am I doing as a playmaker who's going to lead the way? Meanwhile, the other side of the map, someone else is leading something else. So they need to all be on the same page, be communicating what their goals are at any given moment. And if they can do that, they have the potential to win this group. Let's not pretend they don't. Team 2. I put Samsung number 2, so naturally we're going to get to TSM at number 1. I don't think that's too unusual compared to what a lot of other people are saying, but we'll touch on Samsung first. So they have very, very strong backline carries. You've probably heard a lot of talk about Crown. Maybe you didn't watch Korea, but you've heard about Crown as this great mid laner, and he is a very good mid laner. I put out an article on him. I think it came out yesterday, on Monday, that is. So you can check out that for more about Crown. I'll talk about him a little bit here too, but he is a very good team fighting, damage dealing mid laner. Ruler as their AD carry, again a really good team fighter. He knows how to deal his damage, how to position. There was a game where he played Ezreal. I can't remember exactly which game, but he would always seem to get in there and land the skill shots right through the gap and get the kill without ever seeming to be in danger. So he's dancing the fights very well. So these two players, very strong backline for them. Samsung have very good persistence. They hang around in games very well. They stall out. If they're not winning, they can still get themselves in a position later to be relevant in the team fights and have a chance. A big part of that is that Crown's champion pool was very heavily focused on Victor, also Azir and Varus. These are all champions that can wave clear from range, so obviously they're very good at stalling games. So they drafted into the ability to stall, but just as a team, they also know how to manage that and how to use those kind of compositions. A problem for them is that they sometimes play not to lose rather than playing to win. So they aren't necessarily, they're being too passive, I think. This was more of a problem kind of earlier in the regular season. I think they part of their improvement for the postseason, especially the Gauntlet, was that they solved some of this, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But in general, they have a history of being a little too passive, letting the games go too long, being too comfortable, being this persistent, stalling kind of a team. And so that comes down partly to the players as well. This is something where Crown is a very good carry, but he's not necessarily the guy out there making a lot of plays. And that might just be, we're talking in contrast to someone like Faker, who's out there making plays all the time, right? So Crown, he's definitely capable of being a playmaker, but he doesn't always play. When you play Victor or Varus, those aren't really big playmaking champions. Azir can be. He's not always the kind of playmaker that when Faker goes out and plays Azir, when Faker plays anything, it suddenly becomes an assassin. So you can't expect other people to do it that way, but Azir does have that potential. Crown is capable of playmaking with it, but behind Crown, if you can't always rely on him every game to go out and take the playmaking mindset, the rest of the roster doesn't necessarily have that mindset either. There was a game that against Rocks in week 8 where Ambition's playing Gragas, and they're getting pressured in, and a lot of waves are crashing into their towers. And instead of Ambition, and the rest of the team looking for a setup where they could do like a siege break, engage, and jump in there with the Grog Assault, try to pick somebody off and turn it around, Ambition spent multiple Grog Assaults just clearing the wave. All he did with it is kill the minions so that they could keep the tower up a little longer. Like, that's the kind of mindset that's a bit of a problem for Samsung, where they're just trying to keep their tower alive rather than trying to turn something around, gain an advantage. They're just waiting for the team fight to happen, kind of, instead of making the team fight happen. So I think this is something that with Core JJ coming in, not that Wraith isn't a playmaker, but I think Core JJ did a little more of this, or somehow with him coming in, the rest of the team did a little more playmaking, and it's something that added to and improved their team identity and when they were playing in the Gauntlet. And also Crown, this is something I talk about in my article as well. Crown added some more playmaking and some more of that champion pool and some more of that mindset in the Gauntlet. And that's a big part of what helped them win through and make it to Worlds in the first place. So they're working in this direction. It's clear that they know that this is an issue for them, and they've been improving on it over time. So hopefully that continues and they keep getting better at this. One other issue, and this is one that's, it's maybe stretching a little bit, but their drafts, I sometimes felt they weren't super well defined. They would, for example, draft a poke composition, but not have a tank that could be a disengage option. So when they're sieging and they're putting in their poke, they don't really have the tools to, if somebody does try to force an initiation on them, can they kind of repel that and back off? Well, they don't have a tank, so it's a little bit of a struggle. They can do the poke, they can maybe land a Verisalt, but that's not enough to deny a tank, or a couple of tanks from jumping on them. So they sometimes build these compositions that are missing one or two of the key pieces, or have one champion or two champions that are kind of out of place, and it's not really built around a cohesive theme. So that's something I'd like to see, hopefully, that they'll improve on. So the question for me for Samsung, can they keep evolving? Can they keep finding more of this playmaking, more of this proactivity? Can Crown keep playing these map-affecting champions rather than just going back to Victor over and over again? Because, you got to play not just what's comfortable, but what's most appropriate for the situation. So if they can keep evolving like that, I think they have the potential to do really well. And I did, in my own power ranking, I put them 5th, and I think they can live up to that. But they're going to have to keep building on their, improving on their weaknesses and building on their strengths if they're going to get there. So, finally, TSM. This is what we're really here for, right? Here's what I think about TSM. I think one of the greatest things about them is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts for TSM. This is what you want as a team. You want to have 5 players come together. They each have their individual strengths. And, if you add them up, that's great. But if you all work together as 5, you achieve more than you would have just with looking at the individuals. So this is something that is absolutely true of TSM. And what's, the way they work together as a unit, the way they move on the map, the way they make their plays is about teamwork, coordination. And their parts are pretty good to start with, especially if you look at Bjergsen and if you look at Doublelift. Really good carries. They're really strong laners. Bjergsen is super versatile. Doublelift can obviously dish out damage alongside anyone. So they've got really good pieces. The rest of the players, I would say, aren't all-stars, but they're very solid. Hauntzer, Svenskeren, Biofrost, all good players. Depending on where your threshold is for great, I don't know if I'd call them great, but they're all good players. So when you've got good parts and they work together to make a really good cohesive whole, you're in a really good spot. I would say of that, just to throw this in there, Bjergsen is the linchpin for me. It's why I didn't actively campaign for him for MVP so much, but I always said he was my MVP vote. I explained it a little bit when the voting came out for the NA regular season All-Pro teams, or for the MVP award, rather. So, and I think the biggest thing for him is that he's not just a player kind of like Crown who goes out and does the team fighting, the carrying, wins his lane, and translates that into damage. His roaming and his team enabling, I would say, are possibly the best of any mid laner in the world in terms of making his entire team better, not just himself. So, you know, to kind of take some of his North American competitors, I think he wins lane as well as or better than Jensen does, but he also affects the entire map for the team as well as probably better than who he does. And you take those two strengths, put them together, you've got Bjergsen. Anyways, so another thing TSM really good at is their clean, firm map play. So they are, I was speaking about with Splyce, you know, the way they coordinate, and they have their split push, and they hit the different points at the different times. Like, this is something TSM is very good at as well. They do it through all stages of the game. They have really good map formations and who's where on the map at different times. They have really good rotations to all join up somewhere and, you know, get a push together or make a play together. They the way they move doesn't really leave a lot of vulnerabilities open for someone to exploit. So they do this throughout the entire game, and it's why they had the best early game in North America. And once they had a lead, they were the best team at playing with the lead and closing out that lead, because they could do it with applying pressure, controlling the map. They could do it with tower dives and team fight initiations and, you know, being aggressive and throwing punches. They could do all of those different things. So they really maximize their snowball opportunities without, while minimizing kind of the risks that can be tied to that kind of the royal style risks of going out and making play after play after play, and eventually some of those might fail. So, and they get heavily punished. So TSM don't really expose themselves to heavy punishments. When they make plays, they sometimes do fail, but they usually have the kind of control or the kind of map set up beforehand where they can't get punished really hard afterwards. So this ties into another kind of positive for them, is that they have really good balance of knowing they never, well, not never, I'd say they don't consistently play too aggressive. They don't consistently play too passive. So there are games when they do press quite hard and they do make some plays, they do make some tower dives, and some of them fail and they get punished a little bit. There are other games where they sometimes don't make plays that I think they had the opportunity to make, and they're a little too passive. But they don't do either of them often, and when they do, they don't do it in such a way that it's really drastic, really severe, and it really hurts them. I think they walk the line between both, and the fact that they have a slightly too aggressive mode and a slightly too passive mode means that it's harder to play against them, because you don't know what they're going to do in any given game, so you don't know what to comp for or how to set up your vision necessarily. You're not sure exactly which TSM you're going to face. So I think that's a really strong attribute for them as well. So on the criticism side, and this isn't just me copping out because I couldn't find anything negative to say about them, I legitimately think that it's hard to find more than minor criticisms about TSM. I think you could point to the three kind of good, not great players, Svenskeren, Hauntzer, Biofrost. You could say they're not really individually dominant. You know, you can see Hauntzer losing lane to Impact and just kind of hanging in, and he still, in the finals, he really helped the team with his Shen play, and it was you know, even though he got solo killed, he'd still go out there and be really good in the team fights, but he isn't individually dominant. He's not usually going out there making big advantages on his own, and, you know, he can do some of that, but not really consistently. And this is not me, like, tearing down Hauntzer as a player. I'm just saying he's not a superstar. Biofrost, you know, a little bit is a little bit inexperienced, and, you know, he's good, but he's mostly good because he helps Doublelift be good. Svenskeren, I think there's a lot more I could say about Svenskeren. I think his main strength is knowing his role in the team and working within that role. The interesting thing about him, I used to have much more negative opinions about Svenskeren than I do now. I think I've come around to him a little bit, but overall, I think TSM enables Svenskeren to be successful more than he enables the rest of the team to be successful, which is not like, again, this is not me saying he's a bad player, but I think a lot of what makes Svenskeren successful is that TSM will win 3 lanes, which allows him to get into the jungle. People go into the jungle with him. You know, they all work together to counter jungle. All these things that have been said before. And I think, you know, obviously he does ganking and he helps his laners and all these things. But on the whole, on the entire balance, I think TSM sets up Svenskeren for success more than vice versa. So maybe that, you know, that's a very small criticism. I think you could maybe criticize TSM a little bit for having too much dragon priority. I think they could maybe back off that objective a little bit. We'll see if they do at Worlds. I think it's good to take all the dragons. Maybe you could be doing something more productive some of the time. I don't know. That's kind of neither here nor there. I think a big question for them, though, is that they haven't really been threatened severely all summer. You know, aside from losing a series to Phoenix 1, you know, it didn't really matter. They haven't really faced real adversity, so I'm curious what it'll look like when if they get in a position where, oh no, we might not win our group, now what do we do? If they go down 1-0 or 2-0, or I guess they haven't gone down 1-0, but if they go down 2-0 or 2-1 in a series, what are they going to do? How are they going to respond? And that's more of a question rather than saying, I think they'll crumble, because I don't think they will, but we have to see it. So that's how I feel about the 4 teams. I rank TSM first. I think that all around they have the fewest weaknesses. They have the most versatility. I think Samsung, you know, I think they'll match up with Royal, you know, their stability against Royal's kind of volatility and who will come out ahead there. It's kind of hard to say, but I think Samsung had better form coming into the tournament than Royal, and that's why I ranked them higher. Royal's talent, I think they'll steamroll Splyce in the early game. That's kind of it. So that's kind of how I rank the 4 teams. So now that I've gone over the 4 teams, happy to do a little bit of Q&A here. So I have some questions that came from Twitter originally. So I'll go through those first just quickly. Ekboat Danny asked, can Crown shut down Bjergsen? So this is one of the individual matchups that's maybe the most exciting in the group, or the most kind of hyped up. And I talked about Crown in an article the other day. I think Crown in a 1v1 lane, if Crown and Bjergsen sit in lane and that's all they do and just kind of butt heads, I don't know. Maybe Crown could beat Bjergsen. It's certainly possible. I think champion matchup will play a lot into it at that point. I don't think Crown would stomp Bjergsen in lane or anything by any means. I definitely think Bjergsen could hold his own, but I don't really know who would come out ahead 1v1. But the bigger question to me is, I'm going to interpret shutdown as, can he, you know, prevent Bjergsen from doing what he has been best at or most important at this summer, which is roaming out, helping Svenskeren, helping the laners, making the team better. And no, I don't think Crown is going to do that. I think Bjergsen is too good at getting out of lane, even if he sacrifices a little bit of the lane in his own strength, which honestly he hasn't done in North America. He's managed to be really good in lane and affect the map at the same time, which is very impressive. So even if maybe he doesn't win lane while affecting the map, I think he's still going to affect the map. And ultimately, I don't think Crown will shut down Bjergsen in that sense. Sorry, excuse me. Another question. Life mechanism. Can Royal never give up 2-0 Samsung through a superior early game? Can they? Yes. Will they? I would probably call this as it'll be a 1-1 through the round robin. I think this is definitely the shape of the matchup, is Royal is going to try to roll over in the early game. Samsung's going to have to hold on and win with better stability, better reactive team fighting in the mid and late game. That's kind of the stereotype of what I would expect to happen in the games. And I think honestly, the most likely scenario is it works for Royal once. It doesn't work for them once, we get a 1-1. But it's certainly possible either team could 2-0 this, and really tough to predict which one will happen. One more question that was on Twitter before. Imp Wannabe asked, what are Royal Never Give Up's and Samsung Galaxy's chances to beat out TSM? This is a really interesting one. So I would say Royal Never Give Up have a better chance to beat TSM than Samsung do, just because Royal has a much wider range of how good and how bad they can be. If they are at their best, I think they can beat TSM. I don't know how confident I am. In fact, I'm not very confident that they will be at their best or at a high enough level of best that they will beat TSM. I think they could take a game off them. I think there's a very good chance they take a game off of TSM. I think it's less likely that Samsung will take a game off of TSM, even though I put them above Royal in the group, just because they have less range from good to bad. So I think Royal Never Give Up could take a game off TSM. I think TSM will beat both teams in the ultimate standings of the group. But I don't know. I guess that's kind of how I feel about those. So I'll pop into the Twitch chat as well, see if we got any questions in there. So now's a good time to drop those in. Question, is that a Firebat? Yes, that one right there is a Firebat. That's a Hydralisk, and that is a High Templar, specifically Tassadar. I got those at Penny Arcade charity, live charity, or I guess it was the silent auction at Penny Arcade Child's Play dinner several years ago. Thoughts on Wraith and whether or not he'll see play? I think there's a really good chance we'll see Wraith. I think, obviously, they brought Core JJ in after the first game against Afrika in the Gauntlet, and it worked, so they kept going with it. I think there's a decent chance that Wraith is back in for Worlds. There's a decent chance Core JJ stays in for Worlds. I think I'd lean a little more towards Core JJ just because that's where they've had the most recent success. But Wraith is a really good player, and it comes down to, in their practice time, has Wraith been able to add the same dimension that Core JJ brought about with the team, whether it's team mentality, whether it's individual play and playmaking, what they bring as a solo player. I don't know. That one's a toss-up for me. I'm not sure who I would pick. Let's see what else is in here. So yeah, I appreciate these questions, and it gives it a little bit more to talk about, some fun angles. Is there a reason TSM prefers dragon control over pushing for first tower? That's one of the questions that I'm kind of asking, right? I think every team is going to prioritize taking the first tower at this point. I don't think TSM would approach it as an either or. You know, we've got the option to do dragon or tower. What are we going to do? We'll pick dragon. I don't think that's the case. I think it's more setting up the map, or what they've done sometimes is set up the map such that dragon becomes the best option. The tower isn't really on the table because the lane is kind of, in central position, so they take the dragon because they've controlled the vision that way. So I want to see them not set up where dragon is the best option. I want to see them set up where tower is the best option, and maybe that's more what you're getting at, but I can't think of a good reason for it. Maybe it depends a little bit what kind of dragon it is, what your team comp is, but I think the first tower is just way too valuable these days. I don't think there's ever a good reason to not build your very early game around creating the opportunity to get that first tower. Okay. Alright. What are TSM's chances to win quarterfinals? That depends entirely on the matchup that they draw, obviously, but I think they'll win quarterfinals. I unless something really weird happens in one of the other groups, I think it's unlikely that they would get matched against an opponent who's likely to beat them. Unless something happens like SKT gets second in the group and TSM draws SKT, I think that could be really tough. But I think the most likely scenario is, barring any craziness, which is craziness is likely to happen. So this is all up in the air. But I think TSM should be favored at this point to make it to the semifinals. Assuming that they win their group. If they don't win their group, all bets are off. And, that's obviously entirely possible. And I think I'll cut it off here with a fun one. What is my favorite team at Worlds? Either Cloud9, because I've enjoyed watching their evolution, and I'm a huge Smoothie fan. The player, not the drink substitute, whatever you want to call it. Or SKT. Because I love their legacy, I love their dynasty, I love their players, and I think Blank is better than the narrative gives him credit for. Which is not to say he's a good player, but I don't think he's the worst jungler who's ever lived, which is what you might assume when you read everything that's written about him. So that's how I feel about that. Thank you for watching the video. This has been my preview of Group D. And if you have any more questions, you can drop them in the YouTube comments afterwards, and I'll be happy to chat there. Thanks for watching.